Alright, welcome back. So in this chapter we're going to have our third modeling time-lapse video, and we're going to concentrate on building out some floor sections. Now, before we get started doing that, what I'm doing right now is just kind of looking at what I've modeled so far and kind of analyzing it with no wireframe on, just to see how everything's reading. Make sure there's no areas that are kind of barren and boring. I'm looking at it from a bunch of different angles just to see how it reads, because if we can get it to look decent at this stage with just base modeling, then I know it'll look that much better once we add texturing, some lighting. So I'm just kind of having a look around here, looking at it from a bunch of different angles, kind of imagining what the player will see. And then turn on the concept art here above, just kind of comparing it, making sure it has the same feel and idea that Cecil was trying to get across in his concept art. And you can see it's very close. Even though I took a lot of liberties and invented a lot of different things, I still kept to the same silhouette he had and the general feel. And so far, so good. So we're going to go ahead and speed up the time lapse here. And in this chapter, the way that I'm going to build the floor is by using modular pieces. So you can see right now what I'm doing is I'm trimming out some squares, some rectangles. And I'm just grabbing them off this grid that I had built in my block out. And in doing this, I'm just going to create a few kind of tile pieces and use them to build out the floor. So this should be a much faster process than building out the walls, because we're only going to need to make a few pieces and then just reuse them. So what I did right now is, starting by using the split polygon tool, I'm just roughing out a shape for one of these kind of modular tile sections for the ground. I'm going to go in here and make a primitive sphere and use this for a bolt of sorts. Now, because we're building these pieces for a ground, we have to treat them a little bit different. So you'll see me put in a lot of small details, like bolts and nuts and stuff like that. But because this is a ground and it's going to end up being pretty flat, a lot of this detail that I'm adding right now we'll probably be able to bake down in the texturing phase. So we won't have to have such high poly geometry as we have right now. And we could probably go as far as baking all this down to a flat plane at some point. But for now, we'll just concentrate on the modeling of this. Anyways, so back to what I'm doing right now. I'm planning out kind of a modular tile set to go around the base of some of these buildings. And so what I'm going to do to start is draw out a few curves and make sure that they are things that can be mirrored. So we'll go ahead and clean these up a little bit. And so the theory is I'm just going to create a few little elements and then tile them around. So we'll do some more curve offsetting. And then we'll loft them and pull some of these edges up. Give them some depth. Harden the edges. And then get rid of the polygons underneath, because we're going to be using these pieces as kind of tileable little details. So I just moved my pivot points again and used the scale tool to mirror it over. And then we'll get rid of the block out and duplicate these pieces over. And you can kind of get the idea of what I'm trying to accomplish here. This will just be a fast way to make a few elements and then use these all over the place. Same thing. Took that new piece I made where I extruded the edges and just reused it. Now the key to this is making sure all the points and pivot points are on the grid. And right now I'm trying to find a spacing that works so that we can create the 45-degree angles here. Looks pretty interesting. And we'll go ahead and put it over here as well, just to see how it looks. Notice I was hitting Shift D once I duplicated it once. That will duplicate it with the offset, which is a useful tool if you're building with modular pieces. So now I'm going to go ahead and try and create a corner piece. So using the Cut Faces tool and holding down Shift, I was able to constrain my cut to a 45-degree angle. And then there's just a little bit of cleanup to do to get all the points on the grid. And we have a nice corner piece. Go ahead and delete the ones that were just temporaries and replace it with the new piece. Now, something that's different in this chapter than previous chapters is that we didn't really have any solid concept of what the floor would look like. Most of Cecil's drawings were for walls and buildings, and that's why I chose to do the floor last in this case. Because after doing the buildings and walls and stuff, now I have a better feel for what the visual target should be, and doing the floor will just be kind of more the same. So what I'm doing right now is creating another tileable floor piece. This one's a square, and again it'll be something that I can reuse all over and just kind of rotate it, move it around. I could put these in groups of 4 or 8, and combined with some of the edge textures I've made, we'll get a bunch of different looks for the floor. So now that we've lofted these curves, I'm going to go ahead and pull the inner edge up a little bit, give it some height, and soften the edges that are curved. There we go. And looking at it from a distance, I'm just making sure that it looks like it fits in the scene. Go ahead and make some kind of bolt detail. Again, something like the bolt will probably in the end just bake down to a texture. I won't actually have that geometry sitting there. It's probably much too expensive. And now here I've gone back to my original curves and pulled out a shape that will kind of nestle inside of the larger shape here. So never delete the curves that you're using to build until you're sure you won't use them again, because here they were useful. I was able to repurpose them for another piece, and it'll fit perfectly inside kind of my larger panel here. And you can tell that this little piece I'm working on right now, I don't quite know what I want to do with it. I've tried a few different things. I tried having it reach out over the paneling, which didn't look too good. And eventually I just went with a simpler shape. And now I've just brought in a primitive cube. I'm going to modify it a little bit, give it some bevels, go ahead and duplicate it, just to give this panel a little bit more surface detail. Let's go ahead and add some bolts in there. And there you have it, another modular piece. Go ahead and center the pivot point on there. Let's go ahead and reapply the shader. Sometimes when you duplicate pieces, where things happen. And now I'm just kind of throwing it around the scene a little bit, seeing what we got going on so far for the floor. Not too bad considering we've made just 2 or 3 pieces at this point. So let's lattice this half a sphere back down, extrude these edges, extrude them again, harden them up, and this could be another little surface detail. Let's just throw this around the scene for now. Not quite sure what I want to do with this yet, but for the time being it's given us a little bit of variety on these panels that are pretty plain at the moment. Okay, so the next thing I think I'm going to try out for this floor here is bringing in this common element of piping. I'm going to run this along the floor and kind of use my piping kit. I went ahead and I grouped these pieces and I shrunk them down by half, just so that they have a slightly different scale than what we see on the walls. And using this, set of piping parts, just going to go ahead here and try and come up with something interesting. I think I'll probably take this whole set of pipes and duplicate it so we have kind of double pipes. Go ahead and put our bracket piece in to break it up so we don't have a lot of dead straight lines all over the floor. Something to keep in mind when you're building a floor is that in most games you don't see it as straight on as you will a wall or a building or something like that. You'll get it at more of a glancing angle. So for me, when I'm building a floor, I tend to put a little bit less detail as I do in the walls and buildings, just because of the fact that we're not going to see it as clearly as we will other things that are more in our line of sight. But again, that depends on the game you're working on. A real-time strategy game, for example, you see mostly the floor. So what I'm doing right now is building kind of a little breaker for these pipes. Another thing to just break up the detail so we don't just have pipe after pipe, an endless straight line. I can make that little housing unit and just plug it all over the place and give everything kind of an irregular look. So since I decided to put two curves next to each other, just scaling up the 90-degree bend piece of the curve, that's not really going to work. So you'll see what I just did there was I redrew out a curve and used the lattice tool so that I could space it out evenly, and these two curves will, fit snug next to each other. And now what I've done really is create a new curve library piece that will work in this kind of situation where I have two curves next to each other. So we got to swap these out. There you go. The smaller curve will always go on the inner side of the bigger curve. And let's go and put a little bit more of this breaker box around here to add some more variety. Now I'm kind of looking at it at the glancing angle that you'll get as a player, seeing how it reads. Even though there's not as much stuff going on the floor here, at the angle that the player sees it actually appears more busy, just because of that glancing angle. Let's go in here and add some more pipes. Go ahead and trim these off. At this point, I'm pretty happy with this kind of minimal amount of floor detail. Like I said, a lot of the flooring will be done in texturing later. We don't need to use as many polygons since it is a floor. There we go. Go ahead and duplicate those over there again. And these, we have two groups of 4 of these guys. Again, check that glancing angle. Do that with wireframe off, just so I can see how everything's lighting up. You'll see at this stage I'm doing that quite a bit. And we'll just go ahead and clip out a big section of the floor right now. We'll pretend that that's an area the player is not going to go. And then we'll use that edge trim that we created at the beginning of the chapter here to kind of finish off this edge. So I'm going to need to duplicate these pieces and create a new kind of inner 90-degree piece. Just space those out, make sure we don't have any geometry sitting on top of other geometry. That's wasteful. And I'm going to make a new little guy. I think this whole thing needs to move over a little bit just so it can be uniform. There we go, that's better. Again, using the cut faces tool, we'll just clean this up, trim off the edges, mirror scale it, and move this piece back over. And there we go. I think that's about all we'll end up doing for the floor right now. Let's go ahead and check some of those angles again. You can see how much busier it looks than it really is. And in the end, we're not going to leave all this as geometry. A lot of this will be baked down to just some tileable textures for the floor. And so one last time, let's compare it to the concept art. Make sure everything's looking cohesive. Go ahead and turn that off. And that'll about do it for this chapter.